The moment Elian breathed his last, the sun vanished. At high noon, absolute darkness swallowed the city of Ethelgard, but that was only the beginning. The earth trembled, tombs cracked open, and the massive veil in the great sanctuary tore from top to bottom. These were not coincidences. They were the earth screaming in response to the death of its king. Most people know about the execution, but few understand the 7 supernatural events that followed, events that terrified soldiers and woke the dead. What do these signs mean for us today? Before we reveal the truth, please like and subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden histories. Now, let us step back in time and witness the moment the world changed forever. The noise was the first thing Commander Marcus noticed. It was not the usual hum of a busy market day in Ethelgard, nor was it the rhythmic chanting of the temple priests during the high holy days. This was a chaotic, jagged wall of sound that rose from thousands of throats, a mixture of mockery, weeping, and the desperate bargaining of merchants trying to sell water to the gawkers. Marcus adjusted the leather strap of his helmet, his eyes scanning the perimeter of Canvapo Hill. He had overseen countless executions during his 20 years serving the Empire, but today felt wrong. The air was too heavy, thick with a tension that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the sweltering heat of the mid-spring sun. 3 wooden structures stood stark against the sky. 2 held men who screamed and cursed, thrashing against their bindings, begging for mercy or spitting defiance at the soldiers guarding them. But the man in the center, the one they called Elian, was silent. Marcus walked toward the central cross, his heavy boots crunching on the dry gravel. He stopped a few paces away, looking up. He expected to see hatred in the prisoner's eyes. He expected fear. Instead, he saw a sorrow so deep it seemed to swallow the insults hurled by the crowd. Elian looked down at the soldiers gambling for his tunic, his breathing shallow and labored, yet his face held no malice. "Keep them back," Marcus barked at a young legionnaire who was letting the crowd press too close to the cordon. "If anyone crosses the line, put them in irons." The soldier nodded, pale-faced, and shoved his spear horizontally to push back a group of jeering elders. These were the religious leaders of Ethelgard, men who had spent the last week maneuvering through political loopholes to demand this execution. They stood in their fine robes, avoiding the dust, pointing crooked fingers at the dying man. "He saved others," one of the elders shouted, his voice cracking with spite. "Let him save himself if he is truly the chosen one of the Great Father." Marcus watched Elian's reaction. The prisoner shifted his weight, a spasm of pain crossing his features, but he did not retort. In all his years, Marcus had never seen a man die like this. Usually, by this stage, the condemned were delirious or begging for death to come quickly. Elian seemed to be waiting, executing a task only he understood. "Water," the prisoner on the left gasped, his voice raspy. "Please, just a drop." A soldier laughed and raised a sponge soaked in sour wine, teasing the man. Marcus shot the soldier a sharp look, silencing the laughter instantly. He did not believe in cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were soldiers of the Empire, not sadists. "Enough," Marcus ordered. "Stand your posts." He turned his attention back to Elian. Above the prisoner's head, a sign had been nailed, written in 3 languages, declaring his crime, King of the Ethelgardians. It was meant to be a mockery, a final insult from Lord Silas, the governor. But as Marcus looked at the crowd, he realized that for many, it was not a joke. He saw women weeping near the back, their faces buried in their hands. He saw men looking away in shame. Elian suddenly lifted his head, his eyes fixing on something distant, something beyond the jeering crowd and the line of steel-clad soldiers. He spoke, his voice weak but clear enough for Marcus to hear. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Marcus froze. He looked around to see who Elian was speaking to, but there was no one there. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was praying for the very men who had driven the nails. He was praying for the soldiers. He was praying for Marcus. The commander felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the wind. He gripped the hilt of his sword, his knuckles turning white. This was not the behavior of a rebel leader or a madman. This was something else. "Sir," the young legionnaire whispered, approaching Marcus again. "The crowd is getting restless. They say it is taking too long." "Death comes in its own time, soldier," Marcus replied, his voice rough. "We wait." The sun beat down relentlessly. It was approaching midday. The heat should have been unbearable, causing the soldiers to sweat beneath their armor. But as the minutes ticked by, the oppressive heat began to shift into something else, a heavy, suffocating pressure, like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm. Yet, the sky remained clear. Elian's breathing grew more ragged. Every breath was a battle. The crowd's insults began to lose their energy, replaced by a murmuring curiosity as the light began to change. It was not a cloud passing over. It was a subtle dimming, as if the sun itself was losing its strength. Marcus looked up, shielding his eyes. The sun was directly overhead, a blazing white disk, but the light reaching the ground was fading, turning a sickly, sepia tone. The shadows on the ground lost their sharp edges. "What is happening?" the soldier asked, fear creeping into his voice. "Steady," Marcus commanded, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Elian again. The prisoner's head was bowed, his body trembling. It felt as though the man on the cross and the sky above were connected, locked in a silent conversation that the rest of the world was only just beginning to witness. The sacrifice of mid-spring was reaching its climax, and the world was beginning to notice. It happened at exactly noon. One moment, the world was bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the high sun. The next, a veil dropped. It was not the gradual encroachment of twilight, nor the gray descent of a winter storm. It was instantaneous and absolute. The sun did not merely dim, it vanished. A collective gasp swept through the thousands gathered on Canvapo Hill. It was a sound of primal terror. People looked up, expecting to see an eclipse, but the moon was full in the cycle, sitting on the opposite side of the earth. This was an impossibility. The sky turned a bruised purple, then plunged into a blackness so deep it felt solid, like a heavy blanket thrown over a cage. Panic erupted immediately. "The gods are angry," a woman shrieked, her voice cutting through the sudden night. "Sorcery!" cried a merchant, dropping his basket of wares. The sound of pottery shattering was deafening in the sudden gloom. Marcus drew his sword, the metallic ring loud in the darkness. "Hold the line!" he roared to his men. "Torches! Light the torches!" The soldiers fumbled with their flint and steel, their hands shaking. Sparks flew, brief flashes of orange in the abyss. But when the torches finally caught fire, the flames seemed weak. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a presence. It seemed to eat the fire, pressing in on the small circles of illumination. Marcus moved toward the crosses, navigating by memory and the dim flickering of the torches. The crowd was pushing back, away from the hill, terrified of being near the dying man when the sky itself had rejected him. Or perhaps, Marcus thought, the sky was mourning him. He reached the base of the central cross. Elian was barely visible, a pale figure against the black wood. The mockery had stopped completely. The elders who had been so vocal just moments ago were now silent, huddled together, their fine robes pulled tight around them. They knew the prophecies. They knew that darkness at noon was a sign of judgment, a cosmic signal that a great wrong had been committed. "Commander," a voice whispered from the darkness. It was the centurion on the right flank. "The men are scared. They say this is the end of the world." "It is an omen," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite his own fear. "But we are soldiers of the Empire. We do not run from shadows." But these were not just shadows. The air grew cold, a biting chill that penetrated the layers of wool and leather. It was the cold of the grave. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had ceased their buzzing. The only sound was the weeping of the women and the ragged breathing of the 3 dying men. For 3 hours, the darkness held. Time seemed to warp. Minutes stretched into hours. The city of Ethelgard, usually visible in the valley below, was gone, swallowed by the void. Only a few faint lights flickered in the distance, showing that the people in the city were lighting lamps in the middle of the day. Marcus paced back and forth, his boots heavy on the ground. He felt isolated, cut off from the reality he knew. He looked at Elian. The prisoner was no longer silent. He was whispering, his voice strained with agony. My God, Elian cried out, the words tearing from his throat. "Why have you forsaken me?" The raw desperation in that voice made Marcus stop in his tracks. It was not a cry of physical pain. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. It sounded as if the darkness was not just around Elian, but inside him, weighing him down with a burden no human could carry. The commander felt a sudden, irrational urge to cut the man down, to stop whatever invisible transaction was taking place. But he could not move. He was a witness, frozen in place by a power far greater than the Empire. The soldiers huddled closer to the torches, their faces pale and sweaty. They whispered prayers to their own foreign gods, asking for protection. But the darkness was indifferent to their pleas. Then, a new sound emerged. A low rumble, vibrating through the soles of Marcus's boots. At first, he thought it was a chariot passing nearby, but the sound came from beneath, not across. The earth was growling. "Steady!" Marcus yelled again, though he had to grab the wooden post of a barrier to keep his balance. The darkness seemed to pulse with the vibration. Elian let out one final, loud cry. It was not a scream of defeat, but a shout of completion. A declaration. "It is finished." And then, his head fell forward. His body went limp. At that exact second, the darkness shattered, not by the return of the sun, but by the violence of the earth. The ground beneath Marcus heaved upward. He was thrown to his knees. The torches fell, sputtering in the dust. The sound of rocks splitting echoed like thunder. The silence of the unnatural night was replaced by the roar of a world tearing itself apart. Marcus looked up from the ground. In the flickering light of a fallen torch, he saw the cross shaking violently, but it stood firm, anchored in the trembling earth, while the world around it collapsed. The death had occurred. The darkness had done its work, and now the earth was responding to the loss of its master. The earth did not merely shake, it convulsed. It was as if the ground beneath Canvapo Hill had suddenly developed a pulse, a violent, erratic rhythm that threw seasoned soldiers off their feet like rag dolls. Commander Marcus slammed into the dirt, the taste of copper and dust filling his mouth. He scrambled to his knees, his hands grasping for purchase, but the soil itself was fluid, rolling like the deck of a ship in a hurricane. Around him, the scene had devolved into absolute bedlam. The crowd of spectators, who only moments before had been hurling insults with such venom, were now screaming in a unified voice of terror. They trampled one another in a desperate stampede to get away from the crosses, to get off the hill, to find anywhere that felt solid, but solidity was a memory. The bedrock of the hill was groaning, a deep, grinding sound that seemed to come from the very center of the planet. Marcus looked up at the central cross. It should have fallen. By all laws of physics, the violent tremors tearing fissures in the hard-packed earth should have toppled the wooden beam, but it stood immovable, while the crosses on the left and right swayed dangerously, threatening to collapse under the weight of the criminals. Elian's cross remained perfectly vertical, anchored in the chaos. "The rocks!" a soldier screamed, pointing toward the cliff face that bordered the execution site. Marcus whipped his head around. The limestone cliffs, ancient and weathered by centuries of wind, were cracking apart. It wasn't a crumbling, it was a violent separation. Massive boulders, the size of chariots, sheared off the cliff face with the sound of cannon fire, crashing down into the valley below. The dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the supernatural darkness that still clung to the edges of the horizon. This was not a natural disaster. Marcus knew the feel of a natural earthquake. He had survived two during his campaigns in the East. Natural earthquakes were impersonal, random. This felt targeted. This felt like a reaction. It felt like the earth was screaming in grief. "Get the men back!" Marcus roared over the din, struggling to stand. "Form a perimeter. Do not let the crowd crush you." He grabbed the arm of a young legionnaire who was frozen in panic, his eyes wide as he stared at the lifeless body of Elian. The soldier was trembling so hard his armor rattled. "He is dead," the soldier stammered, his voice barely audible over the roaring earth. "He died, and the world broke." "Move, soldier." Marcus shoved him toward the line. But the soldier was right. The timing was impossible to ignore. The moment the breath had left Elian's lungs, the stability had left the ground. Marcus looked back at the body. Elian hung limp, his head resting against his chest. The suffering was over, but the impact was just beginning. The darkness that had swallowed the sun for 3 hours began to retreat, not because the sun was returning, but because the air was now thick with the gray dust of pulverized stone. A fissure opened up just 10 paces from where Marcus stood. It unzipped the ground with a tearing sound, exposing the dark roots of the earth. A group of religious elders, who had been standing pompously near the front, shrieked and scrambled backward, their fine robes snagging on thorns, their dignity forgotten in the face of annihilation. They had come to witness a death to protect their laws, but now the very laws of nature were unraveling around them. Marcus felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the dust. He looked at the centurion guarding the prisoners. The man's face was a mask of awe. They were professional killers, trained to inflict death without blinking, yet here they were, terrified not by an army, but by the silence of one dead man and the roar of the rocks responding to him. The shaking continued, wave after wave. It was a physical manifestation of the anger Marcus felt radiating from the sky. The spear in his hand felt heavy, useless. What good was a spear against a mountain that refused to hold still? What good was the authority of the empire when the ground itself was in rebellion? "It is the breath of the depths," the young soldier whispered again, having returned to Marcus's side. "The earth cannot bear his weight now that he is gone." Marcus did not silence him this time. He simply watched the cross, the only still point in a turning, breaking world, and felt the terrifying certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The tremor traveled fast, moving like a serpent beneath the soil, racing from the hill of Canvapo down into the heart of Ethelgard. In the governor's palace, Lord Silas stood by the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the marble sill. He had thought the darkness was the worst of it. For 3 hours, he had paced his chambers by candlelight, terrified by the sudden eclipse, wondering if the gods of the empire had abandoned him. When the light had started to return, he had exhaled, believing the nightmare was over. He had poured himself a goblet of wine, ready to wash away the memory of the morning's trial and the nagging guilt of condemning an innocent man. Then the floor buckled. The wine goblet danced across the table and shattered against the wall. A heavy bust of the emperor, carved from solid granite, tipped forward and crashed to the mosaic floor, decapitating the stone image of the ruler. Silas grabbed a pillar to steady himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. The palace, a fortress built to withstand sieges and storms, was groaning. The sound was sickening, the screech of stone grinding against stone, the popping of timber beams under immense pressure. "My lord!" A servant burst into the room, sliding on the shaking floor. "The walls, the eastern wall is cracking." Silas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the city below. From his vantage point, he could see the panic spreading through the streets of Ethelgard. People were pouring out of their houses, looking like ants whose hill had been kicked over. Clouds of dust plumed upward from the market district where buildings were shedding their facades. But it was what was happening beyond the city walls that made Silas's blood run cold. The earthquake was ripping through the Valley of the Ancients, the sacred burial ground where the wealthy and the holy had been interred for generations. Silas watched in horror as the side of the valley seemed to shear away. He could see, even from this distance, the massive stone discs that sealed the tombs being tossed aside like children's toys. "The graves," Silas whispered, the word catching in his throat. "It is opening the graves." He had sent a man to death to keep the peace, to prevent a riot, to maintain the status quo. But the death of the carpenter had triggered chaos far greater than any political uprising. The very foundations of the city were being tested. Down in the streets, the panic was blind and feral. A merchant named Jareth abandoned his cart of spices as the cobblestones beneath him heaved upward, creating a ramp that launched his wares into the air. He scrambled toward the Temple Mount, seeking sanctuary, but the temple itself seemed to be the epicenter of the violence. The massive stones of the outer wall, rocks so large that legends said giants had placed them, were shifting. Jareth saw a woman fall, clutching her child. He moved to help her, but a tremor knocked him sideways. He looked up at the great fortress of the empire that loomed over the temple. The soldiers on the ramparts were clinging to the battlements, their spears dropped, their discipline shattered. "It is the end," a man shouted, running past Jareth with blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "The judgment is here." Silas, still in his palace, felt a fresh wave of terror as a large crack appeared in the fresco on his ceiling. It ran directly through the painting of the goddess of justice. He stumbled back, shielding his head. He remembered the warning his wife had given him that morning. Have nothing to do with that innocent man. He had ignored her. He had washed his hands. But the earth was not letting him wash away the consequences. The shaking reached a crescendo, a violent shudder that felt as though the city was being lifted and dropped, and then, as quickly as it had intensified, the violent motion subsided into a low, vibrating hum. The dust hung thick in the air, turning the afternoon sun into a bloody haze. Silas straightened his robe, trying to regain some semblance of authority. He needed reports. He needed damage assessments. He needed to know that the empire still stood. "Get the captain of the guard," Silas barked at the terrified servant. "I want to know the extent of the damage, and send a runner to the hill. I want confirmation that the prisoner is dead." He needed Elian to be dead. He needed the problem to be buried. But as he looked out at the valley of the ancients, where the open mouths of the tombs gaped black against the gray dust, Lord Silas felt a sinking dread that death was no longer the final word he thought it was. The walls he had built to protect his power had cracked, and something uncontrollable was beginning to seep through the fissures. Inside the great sanctuary of Ethelgard, the air was suffocating. The supernatural darkness that had choked the city for 3 hours had seeped into the holy corridors, making the golden lamps burn with a feeble, terrified light. High Priest Caius stood before the great altar, his hands trembling as he attempted to pour the evening oil. The rituals had to continue. The laws demanded it. Even if the sun refused to shine, the machinery of their religion could not stop. But the atmosphere was brittle. The younger priests were whispering in the corners, their eyes wide with panic. They had heard the reports from the hill, the earthquake, the darkness, the death of the man named Elian. Caius hissed at them to be silent, trying to maintain the dignity of the priesthood, but his own heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then the floor pitched violently beneath them. The heavy golden menorah swayed and crashed to the stone pavement, extinguishing its flames. The scent of spilled oil and burning wicks filled the room. Caius grabbed the edge of the altar to keep from falling, watching in horror as cracks spiderwebbed across the pristine marble floor. The temple, the eternal house of the Great Father, was shaking as if it were made of straw. But the true terror was not beneath their feet. It was hanging directly in front of them. Dominated the room was the veil. It was a masterpiece of weaving, a massive barrier 60 feet high and 30 feet wide, woven from threads of blue, purple, and scarlet. It was 4 inches thick, a wall of fabric so dense that it was said 2 teams of horses pulling in opposite directions could not tear it. It was the physical boundary between the holy place, where the priests served, and the forbidden sanctuary, the dwelling place of the divine presence. No man could pass through it and live, save for the high priest, and even he could enter only once a year, bearing blood. As the earthquake reached its crescendo, a sound erupted that drowned out the grinding of the stones. It was a sharp, shrieking tear, loud enough to shatter the eardrums. Caius looked up, his eyes bulging. The veil was tearing. It did not rip from the bottom, where a man might have cut it. It split from the very top, far beyond human reach, as if an invisible giant had seized the hem and pulled it apart with unstoppable force. The sound continued, a long, agonizing shriek of fabric giving way, echoing through the cavernous hall. The thick tapestry, which had hidden the secrets of the divine for centuries, unraveled in seconds. The 2 halves of the massive curtain slumped to the floor, collapsing in heavy heaps of dust and thread. For the first time in history, the forbidden sanctuary was exposed. Caius threw himself to the floor, covering his head, screaming for the others to look away. He expected fire to consume them. He expected the wrath of the Great Father to incinerate them for seeing what was forbidden. He waited for death, but death did not come. Slowly, agonizingly, the shaking stopped. The dust began to settle in the shafts of light that were now piercing through the cracks in the roof. Silence returned to the temple, heavy and profound. Caius lifted his head, inch by inch. He looked into the dark recess that had been hidden for generations. There was no fire, there was no thunder. There was only an empty space, quiet and accessible. The barrier was gone. The separation was ended. A young priest, barely a man, stood up near the fallen menorah. He looked at the torn veil, then at Caius, his face pale with shock. "The way is open," the young man whispered, his voice trembling. "The wall is down." Caius stared at the ruins of the curtain. He realized with a sinking dread that the system he had served his entire life, the system of separation, of mediators, of keeping the people out had just been rendered obsolete. The death of the man on the hill had not just broken the earth, it had broken the barrier between humanity and the divine. The Great Father was no longer locked behind velvet and stone. He was loose. While the priests cowered in the ruins of their rituals, the city of Ethelgard was witnessing a miracle that defied every law of nature. The earthquake had done violence to the Valley of the Ancients, cracking open the limestone tombs that lined the eastern ridges. The heavy stones sealing the entrances had been rolled away or shattered. But as the dust settled and the terrified citizens dared to look toward the graveyard, they saw that the tombs were not merely broken, they were active. In the fading light of the afternoon, movement stirred in the shadows of the sepulchres. A woman named Mara was hurrying through the lower streets, trying to get home to her children. She passed the old cemetery gate, clutching her shawl tight against the chill wind. She glanced nervously at the broken tombs, expecting to see looters or wild dogs. Instead, she saw him. Walking out of the shadows of a crypt that had been sealed 10 years ago was a man. He was not a corpse. He did not stumble like the sick or shuffle like the aged. He moved with a strength and grace that seemed otherworldly. He wore simple linen burial clothes, but they were white and clean, untouched by the decay of the grave. Mara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that walk. She knew the tilt of that head. "Father," she whispered, the word barely a sound. The figure turned. It was indeed her father, who had died of a fever a decade prior, but the lines of pain and age were gone from his face. He looked radiant, solid, and undeniably alive. He looked at her not with the blank stare of a ghost, but with eyes full of recognition and a profound, peaceful joy. He did not speak, but the message in his eyes was clear. Death has lost. All across the district, similar scenes were unfolding. The grave, which had been a one-way door since the beginning of time, had suddenly swung open in the opposite direction. A group of soldiers patrolling near the valley wall drew their swords as figures approached them from the tombs. They were ready to fight rebels or thieves, but as the figures drew closer, the soldiers lowered their weapons, their hands shaking. These were not enemies. These were the saints of old, the holy men and women whose names were carved on the monuments in the city square. One soldier dropped to his knees, recognizing the face of a prophet who had been martyred a century before. The prophet walked past him, heading toward the holy city, his gaze fixed on the Temple Mount. These risen ones did not cause chaos. They did not scream or attack. They simply walked, a silent procession of witnesses testifying to the power of the event that had just occurred on the hill. Their very existence was a rebuke to the finality of death. In the market square, a hush fell over the crowd as a small group of these risen saints passed through. People pressed back against the walls, terrified yet mesmerized. They reached out to touch them, to see if they were spirits or illusions. Those who brushed against their sleeves felt warm flesh and living fabric. "How is this possible?" a merchant asked, his voice shaking. "They were dead. We buried them." "The price has been paid," an old woman replied, tears streaming down her face as she watched the procession, the man on the cross. He bought them back. The connection was impossible to miss. Elian had died, and in his dying, he had picked the lock of the underworld. The earthquake had been the sound of the prison doors breaking open. Mara stood, rooted to the spot as her father approached. He stopped in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. The touch was warm, reassuring. It grounded her in a reality that felt more real than anything she had ever known. She realized then that the world she understood, a world where death was the end, where goodbyes were, forever was gone. A new era had begun, one where the grave was merely a waiting room, and the keys were held by the man who had just breathed his last on the hill of execution. The dead walked the streets of Ethelgard, not to haunt the living, but to herald the victory of life. The dust on Canvapo Hill began to settle, coating the armor of the Imperial Guard in a layer of ghostly gray. Commander Marcus stood amidst the wreckage of the execution site, his boots planted in the fissures that the earthquake had torn into the ground. His heart was hammering a rhythm that felt entirely foreign to him, not the adrenaline of battle, but the frantic, hollow beat of fear. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. For 20 years, Marcus had served the Empire. He had marched across burning deserts and frozen tundras. He had looked into the eyes of barbarians charging with axes and had not flinched. He had overseen the deaths of hundreds of men, rebels, thieves, murderers. To him, death was a trade, a transaction of law and order. It was messy, yes, but it was explainable, it was human. But what had just happened was not human. He looked up at the central cross. The body of Elian hung motionless. The violence of the earthquake had passed, replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy. The soldiers around him were slowly picking themselves up from the dirt, their faces pale, eyes darting nervously at the sky, expecting the sun to vanish again, or the earth to open up and swallow them whole. "Commander," the voice of the young legionnaire was thin, barely a whisper. "Is it over? Is he dead?" Marcus walked forward. He did not check the other two prisoners. Their groans proved they were still lingering in their agony. He stopped directly in front of Elian. He looked at the face that was now still. Even in death, there was no grimace of hate, no contortion of final defiance. There was only peace, a terrifying, unnatural peace that seemed to judge the violence of the world simply by existing. Marcus replayed the last few hours in his mind. The sky turning black at noon, the way the man had spoken to his mother, the way he had promised paradise to the thief beside him, the way he had cried out, not for revenge, but for forgiveness, and finally, the way the earth had convulsed the moment his spirit departed. The logic of the empire, the logic of steel and blood that had ruled Marcus's life, crumbled. Rome had taught him that power was the ability to kill, but this man had shown him a different kind of power, the power to lay down life willingly. Rome could break bodies, but it could not command the sun to hide. It could not make the rocks cry out. A sudden realization struck Marcus with the force of a physical blow. They had not executed a criminal. They had not crushed a rebellion. They had killed something holy. He felt the armor on his chest constrict, becoming a cage. He could not breathe. The weight of his own guilt, the guilt of his men, the guilt of the cheering crowd, settled on his shoulders. He fell to his knees. It was an uncharacteristic breach of discipline for a commander of the guard, but his legs simply refused to hold him. He looked up at the lifeless figure, his vision blurring. He did not care that his men were watching. He did not care about the reports he would have to write for Lord Silas. "Surely," Marcus whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "surely this man was the Son of God." The words hung in the still air. It was treason to say it. The emperor was the only son of the gods, according to the law. But the law felt small and petty now, a scrap of paper against a hurricane. The truth was written in the cracks of the earth and the returning light of the sun. The soldiers around him heard the confession. They did not mock him. They did not report him. They lowered their heads, gripping their spears, the same realization dawning in their eyes. They had been the instrument of a cosmic mistake. "Break their legs," Marcus ordered, his voice returning but lacking its usual bite. "End it for the others, but leave him. He is already gone." He stood up, wiping the dust from his knees. He felt different. The hardness that had encased his heart for decades had developed a fissure, just like the ground beneath him. Light was seeping in, painful and revealing. He turned to look at the city of Ethelgard in the distance, knowing that he would walk down this hill a different man than the one who had marched up it. The executioner had died alongside the prisoner, and something new was struggling to take its first breath. The chaos in the streets of Ethelgard provided the perfect cover. As the people wailed and inspected the damage to their homes, two men moved quickly through the shadows of the temple district, heading toward the upper city. Namturk Alden walked with a determination that frightened him. He was a wealthy man, a respected member of the High Council, a man with everything to lose. For 3 years, he had watched Elian from the shadows, listening to his teachings, admiring his miracles, but always from a safe distance. He had voted against the arrest in the secret meetings, but quietly, timidly, he had been a secret disciple, hoarding the truth like a miser hoards gold. But the darkness and the earthquake had shattered his caution. Silence was no longer a strategy. It was a betrayal. Beside him walked Scholar Cato, the great teacher of the law. Cato was old, his beard gray, his back slightly bent, but his eyes burned with a fierce resolve. He carried a heavy satchel that smelled of myrrh and aloes, 75 pounds of royal spices. It was a fortune, enough to bury a king. "Are you sure, Alden?" Cato asked, his voice low as they navigated a street littered with fallen masonry. "Once we do this, there is no going back. The council will cast us out. Lord Silas might view it as treason." "Let them," Alden replied, not breaking his stride. "I spent my life building a reputation, Cato. I spent years protecting my position. And today, I watched the only innocent man I have ever known die while I sat in my palace. I will not let him be thrown into the common pit with thieves. I will not." They reached the gates of the governor's palace. The guards were disorganized, still reeling from the tremors. Alden used his authority, flashing his council ring, and demanded an audience with Lord Silas. They found the governor on the terrace, staring blankly at a crack that had split the mosaic floor. Silas looked aged, his face gray, a goblet of wine trembling in his hand. He looked up as the two men entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. "Alden," Silas said, his voice hollow. "Why are you here? The city is falling apart. The gods are furious." "The prisoner is dead, my lord," Alden said, stepping forward. He kept his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I have come to ask for the body of Elian of Nazareth." Silas flinched at the name. "Dead? Already? It has only been a few hours." The commander confirmed it. Alden lied smoothly, though he knew the report would arrive soon enough. "I wish to bury him in my own tomb, according to our customs." Silas stared at him. "You, a member of the council? You want to bury a traitor?" "I want to bury a man," Alden corrected him. "And surely, my lord, you wish for this affair to be over. If the body remains on the cross during the high Sabbath, the people will riot. They are already terrified. Let me take him away. Let me hide the evidence of this day." It was a shrewd argument. Silas cared nothing for customs, but he cared deeply about order. He wanted Elian gone. He wanted the memory of the trial, the dream of his wife, and the darkness of the afternoon to vanish. "Take him," Silas waved his hand dismissively, turning his back on them. "Do what you want. Just get him out of my sight." Alden and Cato bowed and retreated quickly before the governor could change his mind. They hurried back out into the cooling evening air. They made their way to Canvapo Hill. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only the soldiers and a few weeping women. Marcus, the commander, was still there. He watched them approach, recognizing Alden's fine robes. "We have permission from Pilate," Alden said, holding up the sealed scroll. Marcus nodded slowly. He did not argue. He seemed relieved that someone was coming to treat the body with dignity. "He is yours." Alden and Cato approached the cross. It was a gruesome, difficult task. They were men of soft hands, men of ink and parchment, not used to physical labor, but they worked with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of the women watching from a distance. They climbed the ladder. They carefully pulled the iron nails from the wood, wincing as if they were feeling the pain themselves. They lowered the body of Elian, catching his weight in a linen sheet. Alden held the upper body, Cato the feet. The contact with the dead man shocked Alden. He expected the cold of death, but he felt a strange, vibrating power, a sense that this was not an end, but a pause. "He is heavy," Cato whispered, tears streaming into his gray beard. "He carries the weight of the world." They carried him to the garden nearby, where Alden's new tomb had been hewn from the rock. It was a rich man's grave, unused, pristine. They laid him on the stone slab. Cato opened his satchel, and they began to wrap the body in strips of linen, layering the spices between the folds. The smell of myrrh and aloes filled the small cave, overpowering the scent of death and dust. It was a royal burial, a burial fit for a king, performed in secret by two fearful men who had finally found their courage in the twilight. They worked in silence, the gravity of the moment pressing down on them. They were touching the body of the one they believed was the Messiah. They were sealing him in rock. It felt like they were burying hope itself. Finally, they finished. They stepped out of the tomb, their robes stained with blood and spices. Together, with the help of their servants, they rolled the massive stone across the entrance. The grinding sound of the stone sealing the tomb echoed in the garden, a final note of finality. Alden placed his hand on the rough surface of the stone. "Sleep well, teacher," he whispered. They turned and walked away into the night, believing their work was done, believing the story was over. They did not know that by sealing the tomb, They had just set the stage for the greatest impossibility the world would ever see. The grinding sound of the massive stone rolling into place echoed through the garden like a thunderclap, signaling the end of the world. It was a sound of absolute finality. The entrance to the hewn rock face was swallowed by the granite barrier, cutting off the last sliver of twilight that might have reached the face of Elian inside. Turk, Alden, and Scholar Cato stood back, their chests heaving from the exertion. They wiped their hands on their robes, leaving streaks of dust and dried spices. They had done their duty. They had given the teacher a resting place fit for royalty, a pristine chamber where no death had ever entered before. But now, staring at the sealed entrance, the weight of their action settled upon them. They were not just leaving a body. They were burying their own hopes. "It is done," Alden whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We should go. The patrols will be doubling their rounds soon." Cato nodded, casting one last look at the gray stone. "We honored him, Alden. That is all we could do." The two men turned and hurried away, their footsteps fading quickly into the gathering gloom. They returned to the city to hide, to mourn, and to wait for the political backlash that would surely come when their deed was discovered. But the garden was not empty. Emerging from the shadows of the cypress trees, where they had been watching in silent vigil, were the women. Elena stepped forward first, her eyes red and swollen, but her jaw set with a fierce, quiet strength. She had followed the procession from the hill. She had watched as they took him down. She had sat at a distance while the two wealthy men performed the rites she longed to do herself. Now, she was alone with him. She walked to the tomb. The air was cooling rapidly, but the stone felt warm to her touch, retaining the heat of the day. She pressed her palms against the rough surface, as if trying to reach the man on the other side. "You said it was not the end," she whispered to the cold rock. Her voice was steady, though tears streamed down her face. "You told us that the seed must fall to the ground and die to bear fruit. But this—" She choked back a sob. "This feels like winter, Elian. Eternal winter." The other women gathered behind her, huddled together for warmth and comfort. They were the ones who had served him, who had supported his travels, who had understood him when the learned men scoffed. Now, they were the ones left to keep watch. Elena remembered the way he had looked at her when he cast the darkness out of her mind years ago. He had given her life back. Now, his life was taken. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. She traced the jagged edge of the stone. It was immovable. A dozen men could not shift it. He was locked away in the dark, wrapped in linens that would soon stiffen with the cold. "We must go, Elena," one of the younger women said gently, touching her arm. "The Sabbath begins. We cannot be found here. We must prepare more spices for when the Sabbath passes." Elena nodded slowly. The law was the law. They had to rest, even if their hearts were restless. But she did not pull her hand away immediately. She pressed her forehead against the granite, closing her eyes. "I will come back," she promised, her voice low and fierce. "As soon as the dawn breaks on the first day, I will be here. I will not leave you alone in the dark." She turned and led the women out of the garden. The tomb stood silent, a gray scar in the hillside. Inside, the body of Elian lay still. The heart that had beaten for the broken was stopped. The hands that had healed the sick were folded. To the world, it was over. The story was finished. The garden settled into the heavy silence of the night, guarding its precious, tragic secret. The sun rose on the high Sabbath, but there was no rest for the wicked, nor for the fearful. Inside the opulent chambers of the high priest, the mood was frantic. The earthquake had stopped. The sun had returned, but the terror remained. The tearing of the veil in the sanctuary had been hastily covered up. A temporary curtain hung to hide the shame, but the image of that split fabric haunted every priest who had seen it. High Priest Caius paced the floor, his robes swishing aggressively. He had achieved his victory. Elian was dead. The threat to their authority was neutralized, yet he felt no triumph. He felt a creeping dread that crawled up his spine. "We cannot just sit here," Caius snapped at the gathered elders. "You heard the reports. Alden and Cato, traitors from our own ranks, buried him. They gave him a martyr's funeral." "He is dead, Caius," one elder muttered, rubbing his temples. "Let it be. The people will forget him in a month." "Will they?" Caius stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Do you not remember what that deceiver said? While he was still alive, He spoke words that make my blood run cold. He said, "After 3 days, I will rise again." A silence fell over the room. They all remembered. They had mocked the claim then, but now, after the darkness and the shaking earth, the words felt less like madness and more like a threat. "If the disciples steal the body," Caius continued, his voice dropping to a sinister hiss, "and tell the people he has risen, the last deception will be worse than the first. We will have a revolution on our hands that Rome cannot squash. We must act." The council moved as one. They broke the Sabbath rules of travel and marched to the governor's palace. They did not care about piety anymore. They cared about survival. Lord Silas was not pleased to see them. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with dark circles. He was trying to forget the events of the previous day, trying to drown the memory of the innocent man's blood in wine and administrative paperwork. When the servant announced the arrival of the chief priests, Silas threw his quill across the room in frustration. "Let them in," he growled. Caius and the elders entered, bowing low, but their desperation made the gesture stiff. "Sir," Caius began without preamble, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' Therefore, give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead." Silas looked at them with utter contempt. These men who had demanded blood were now afraid of a corpse. They were afraid of a ghost story. "You have a guard," Silas said coldly, waving his hand toward the door. "Go, make it as secure as you know how." He wanted them out. He wanted nothing more to do with Elian of Nazareth. If sealing a rock would shut these men up, he would grant it. Caius bowed, a triumphant sneer curling his lip. "We will." They took a detachment of Roman guards, 16 battle-hardened soldiers, who looked at the priests with disdain but followed orders. The procession marched back to the garden tomb. The soldiers checked the perimeter, their spears ready. Caius walked up to the massive stone. He demanded the soldiers inspect the seal. They pushed against it. It was solid. There was no way in, and certainly no way out. "Seal it," Caius ordered. The soldiers brought forward a pot of wax, heating it over a torch until it was bubbling liquid. They took thick ropes and stretched them across the stone, anchoring them to iron pegs driven into the rock face on either side. Then, they poured the hot wax over the knots. Before the wax could harden, the captain of the guard pressed the signet ring of the Roman governor into the red blob, the imperial seal. It was the highest authority in the known world. To break this seal was to declare war on Rome itself. The punishment for tampering with it was immediate and painful crucifixion. Caius stepped back, admiring the work. The tomb was now a fortress. It was guarded by Roman steel and protected by Roman law. "Now," Caius said, smoothing his beard, "let us see him rise." The soldiers took their positions, 4 guarding the entrance directly, the others resting in shifts around the perimeter. They lit a fire as the evening approached, joking quietly among themselves about guarding a dead man. Caius and the elders left, feeling a sense of deep satisfaction. They had won. They had covered every angle. They had anticipated every trick. They had locked God in a box and thrown away the key. But as the sun set on the 2nd day, casting long shadows over the garden, the stone stood silent. The wax hardened. The seal was set. The world waited for the 3rd day, unaware that all the power of Rome and all the schemes of the priests were about to be shattered like glass against an anvil. The silence of the tomb was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a breath being held before a shout. The weight was a physical weight, pressing down on the chest of every living soul in Ethelgard. For the 16 Roman soldiers stationed at the garden tomb, the assignment was an insult. They were veterans of the northern campaigns, men who had broken barbarian lines and stormed fortified cities. Now, they were babysitting a rock. The captain of the guard, a scarred veteran named Valerius, paced back and forth in front of the sealed entrance, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel path. He hated this silence. In battle, there was noise, the clash of steel, the screams of men, the roar of orders. Noise was honest. But this garden was wrapped in a suffocating quiet that made his skin crawl. The wax seal on the stone, stamped with the governor's ring, gleamed in the flickering light of their campfire. It was a ridiculous measure, Valerius thought. A dead man does not walk. A corpse does not challenge the might of the empire. Pass the wine, a soldier grumbled from near the fire. This night is longer than a winter siege. Keep your wits, Valerius snapped, though he felt the same lethargy. The priests are paranoid. They think the disciples will try to steal the body before the sun rises on the first day. We are here to ensure that the only thing that leaves this garden is the morning mist. But as the hours of the Sabbath dragged on, the soldiers grew restless. They were not afraid of thieves. A few fishermen and tax collectors were no match for imperial steel. They were afraid of the atmosphere. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, yet the sky was clear and starless. The birds were silent. The wind had died. It felt as though the garden itself was holding its breath, waiting for a signal that no human ear could hear. Across the city, in a small, shuttered room in the lower district, the atmosphere was different, but equally heavy. Elena sat on the floor, her hands working mechanically with a mortar and pestle. The rhythmic grinding sound was the only noise in the room. She was preparing more spices, myrrh, aloes, and sweet cinnamon. It was a futile task, perhaps, but it was the only thing she could do. The law of the Sabbath forbade travel, forbade work, forbade visiting the grave, so she sat, trapped in the rest that felt like torture. Beside her, the other women sat with heads bowed. They were exhausted from weeping. The image of Elian on the cross was burned into their minds, but the image of the stone rolling shut was worse. It was the finality of it. "Do you think the guards will let us near?" one of the younger women whispered, breaking the silence. "They say the high priest sent a full detachment." "We will go anyway," Elena said, her voice flat but firm. "We will ask, we will beg, and if they refuse, we will wait until they leave. I need to see him one last time." We did not have time to wash the blood from his hair properly. The grief in the room was palpable, a thick fog that obscured any hope. They remembered the promise Elian had made about rising, but grief had a way of drowning out prophecy. To them, death was an absolute wall. They were preparing spices for a body, not a welcome for a king. They were planning a funeral, unaware that they were sitting on the edge of a coronation. Back in the governor's palace, Lord Silas could not sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling where the plaster had cracked during the earthquake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the prisoner. He heard the strange, unnatural silence of the crowd when the darkness fell. He got up and poured himself another cup of strong wine. He told himself it was just political stress. He told himself that once the third day passed and the body remained rotting in the grave, the superstition would die and order would return. But deep in his gut, Silas felt a gnawing dread. He felt like a man who had built a dam out of twigs to hold back the ocean. The seal on the tomb was the strongest authority he possessed, but against the memory of the trembling earth, it felt pitifully weak. The night deepened. The darkness seemed to press against the torches of the guards in the garden. The soldiers stopped joking. They stood shoulder to shoulder, gripping their spears, their eyes darting to the shadows. Something was coming. They could feel the vibration of it in the soles of their boots, a low-frequency hum that was not sound, but power. The seventh day was ending, and the silence was about to be broken forever. The shift change happened during the fourth watch of the night, the darkest hour just before the hint of dawn. The soldiers were weary, their eyes gritty with lack of sleep, but they remained alert. Valerius checked the seal again. The red wax was unbroken. The ropes were taut. The massive stone had not moved a hair's breadth. Almost morning, Valerius muttered to his second-in-command, "Once the sun hits that rock, our duty is done. We can go back to the barracks and sleep for 2 days." He turned his back to the tomb to warm his hands by the dying fire. That was when the world exploded. It did not start with a sound, but with light. A flash so intense, so pure and blinding, that it turned the night into a white-hot noon in a fraction of a second. Valerius screamed, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes, but the light seemed to pass through his flesh, searing his retina. It was not fire, it was glory. It was a radiance that did not cast shadows but annihilated them. Then came the impact. The earth buckled violently, far worse than the tremor at the crucifixion. This was not the shaking of death. This was the shaking of something massive breaking through the crust of reality. The ground rippled like water. The 16 soldiers, trained to stand firm against charging cavalry, were tossed into the air like dry leaves in a hurricane. They crashed to the ground, their armor clattering, their weapons flying from their hands. Valerius tried to push himself up, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. Through the blinding whiteness, he saw a figure descending. It was not a man. The figure landed on the earth with the weight of a mountain and the lightness of a feather. His appearance was like lightning captured in form, crackling with energy. His clothing was white as fresh snow, blazing with an inner illumination that hurt to look at. This was a messenger of the high court, a warrior of the unseen realm, stepping into the physical world. The terror that seized the soldiers was absolute. It was a primal, paralyzing fear that froze the blood in their veins. They could not move. They could not scream. They became, as the old texts would later say, like dead men, conscious but utterly incapacitated by the overwhelming presence of holiness. The messenger did not look at the soldiers. They were irrelevant. He walked toward the tomb. Valerius watched, paralyzed, his breath caught in his throat. He saw the angel approach the massive stone, the barrier that had required a lever and 4 men to roll into place. The angel did not strain. He did not search for a handhold. He simply reached out. With a sound like a cracking whip, the imperial seal shattered, the wax disintegrated, the thick ropes snapped as if they were made of spider silk. The angel placed one hand on the rough granite. With a casual, effortless motion, he rolled the stone away. The grinding noise was deafening, the sound of death's jaw being forced open. The stone spun away from the entrance and settled on the side. The angel sat on the stone, crossing his arms, his face radiating a terrifying serenity. The tomb was open. Valerius expected to see a corpse. He expected to see the decay of 3 days. But the light from the angel spilled into the cavern, illuminating the interior. It was empty. No, not empty. The linen wrappings were there. They lay on the stone slab, collapsed and flat, preserving the shape of the body they had held, like a cocoon after the butterfly has emerged. The headcloth was folded neatly in a separate place, but the body of Elian was gone. He had not walked out past the soldiers. He had not slipped past the seal. He had simply transitioned. He had changed states. The shock was too much for the soldiers. One by one, their minds shut down in self-defense. They slumped into the dirt, fainting from the sheer magnitude of the impossible. Valerius was the last to lose consciousness. His final sight before the darkness took him was the open black mouth of the tomb. No longer a prison, but a passage. The authority of Rome, the seal of the governor, the might of the army, all of it had been brushed aside by a single gesture from heaven. The sun began to peek over the horizon, casting its first golden rays onto the garden, but the true light had already risen. The dawn had arrived, and with it, a new reality where stones could roll, seals could break, and death could no longer hold its prisoners. The silence was over. The roar of life had begun. Elena and the small group of women moved through the pre-dawn mist like ghosts. The city of Ethelgard was still asleep, its streets quiet and gray, unaware of the cosmic violence that had just occurred in the garden. The women carried jars of heavy clay filled with expensive spices, their arms aching from the weight, but their hearts were heavier. They walked with their heads down, their eyes swollen from 3 days of weeping. Their conversation was practical, a shield against the overwhelming grief. "Who will roll the stone away for us?" one of the women asked, her voice trembling. "It is too heavy for us, even if we all push together, and the guards, surely they will stop us." Elena did not answer. She had no plan. She was driven by a desperate need to be near him one last time, to finish the burial rites that had been rushed on the evening of the execution. She would beg the soldiers. She would claw at the stone with her bare hands if she had to. Love did not calculate odds. It simply moved forward. They reached the edge of the garden just as the sun began to bleed its first golden light over the horizon. Elena looked up, bracing herself for the sight of the Roman crest and the grim line of soldiers. She stopped dead in her tracks. The jar of spices slipped from her hands and shattered on the path, the scent of cinnamon exploding into the cool morning air. The soldiers were gone. Their spears lay scattered in the dirt like abandoned toys. But that was not what made Elena's heart stop. It was the tomb. The massive granite stone, the one that had sealed hope inside the earth, had been rolled away. It sat off to the side, looking small and defeated. The mouth of the tomb gaped open, a black void against the gray rock face. "They have stolen him," Elena gasped, panic rising in her throat like bile. The priests came and took him away to shame him further. She did not wait for the others. She ran. She sprinted past the abandoned campfire, past the scattered weapons, and threw herself into the opening of the cave. She expected to see chaos. She expected to see a grave robbed by violent men. Instead, she found absolute, terrifying order. She stepped into the cool interior. The light from the entrance spilled across the stone slab where Elian had been laid. The body was gone, but the grave clothes remained. This was what froze Elena's blood. If thieves had stolen the body, they would have taken the wrapped corpse entirely. If they had unwrapped him, the linens would be piled in a heap, cut or torn in haste. These linens were not torn, they were collapsed. They lay flat on the stone, preserving the shape of the shoulders, the torso, the legs, as if the body inside had simply vaporized, allowing the cloth to settle gently onto the slab. And there, separated from the rest, was the cloth that had covered his face. It was not thrown aside. It was folded neatly, placed with deliberate care in a separate spot. It was the signature of someone who was in no hurry. It was the mark of a sleeper who had woken up, made his bed, and left. "Do not be afraid." The voice came from the shadows, resonating not just in their ears but in their chests. Elena spun around. Two figures stood in the corner of the tomb. They were not men. Their clothes shone like lightning, illuminating the damp cave with a brilliance that forced the women to shield their eyes. The women fell to the ground, pressing their faces into the dirt, terrified by the proximity of such power. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" the figure asked. The question hung in the air, absurd and wonderful. "He is not here. He has risen, just as he told you." Elena lifted her head, squinting against the light. Risen. The word did not make sense. Dead men did not rise. Dead men stayed in the earth. But the tomb was empty. The linens were flat. The stone was moved. "Go," the messenger commanded. "Go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. He is going ahead of you into the northern province. There you will see him." Elena scrambled backward, grabbing the hands of the other women. They stumbled out of the tomb, blinking in the sunlight that now seemed brighter, sharper than it had ever been before. They did not speak. They ran. They ran with a mixture of fear and joy that threatened to burst their hearts. The world had turned upside down. The worst thing that could happen, death, had happened, and somehow it had been reversed. As they raced back toward the city, Elena realized she was no longer carrying spices to mask the scent of decay. She was carrying the news that would rewrite history. The tomb was a mouth, and it had just spoken a word that would echo for eternity: life. Captain Valerius woke to the sensation of gravel digging into his cheek. He groaned, rolling onto his back, his head throbbing as if he had been kicked by a warhorse. He blinked, trying to clear the white spots from his vision. Memory returned in a violent rush. The light, the shaking earth, the being that had descended from the sky. He sat up with a start, grabbing for his sword. It lay 5 paces away, useless. He looked around. His men were beginning to stir, groaning, clutching their heads, looking like the survivors of a battlefield massacre. But there was no blood. There were no enemy bodies. There was only the open tomb. Valerius scrambled to his feet, swaying dizzily. He walked to the entrance. He did not dare go inside. He didn't need to. From where he stood, he could see the empty slab. "Captain," a soldier whispered, his voice shaking. Where is the body?" "Gone," Valerius rasped. "He is gone." Panic, cold and sharp, replaced the shock. They were Roman soldiers. Their one duty had been to guard a sealed grave. They had failed. The penalty for sleeping on watch was death. The penalty for losing a prisoner, even a dead one, was death. "We have to flee," the soldier said, eyeing the horizon. "If we run now, we can make it to the border before Lord Silas sends the trackers." "And live as deserters?" Valerius spat. "Hunted like dogs? No." He looked toward the city. He knew Silas would have them executed without a trial to save his own reputation. But there was another option. The men who had asked for the guard in the first place, the priests, they had the most to lose. "We go to the high priest," Valerius ordered. "Gather your weapons. Try to look like soldiers, not frightened children. The march back to the city was the longest walk of Valerius's life. They moved through the back alleys, avoiding the morning crowds, and arrived at the high priest's residence. When Caius heard the guards were at the gate, he turned pale. He ordered them brought to his private chambers immediately. When Valerius entered, Caius saw the look in the captain's eyes, the look of a man who has seen something that shattered his reality. "Tell me," Caius demanded, his voice tight. "Tell me you caught the thieves." Valerius laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Thieves? No, there were no thieves, priest." And then he told him about the light that burned like the sun. He told him about the earth shaking. He told him about the being who rolled the stone away with one hand. He told him about the empty linens. As Valerius spoke, the color drained from Caius's face. The high priest sank into his chair. It had happened. The nightmare scenario. The man he had killed had defied the grave. If this truth got out, if the people knew that Rome and the temple had been defeated by a resurrection, their power would evaporate before noon. Caius looked at the elders gathered in the room. They were trembling. They knew the truth now. They had the testimony of 16 unimpeachable witnesses. They had the evidence of the empty tomb. The logical, spiritual response would be to fall to their knees and repent. But power is a drug stronger than truth. Caius stood up. He walked to a heavy iron chest in the corner of the room. He unlocked it and began pulling out bags of gold temple treasury funds, money dedicated to God, now being used to silence his miracle. He walked back to Valerius and dropped the heavy bags into the soldier's hands. The weight was substantial. It was enough money to buy a vineyard, a house, a new life. "You saw nothing," Caius said, his voice low and dangerous. "You were asleep." Valerius stared at the gold. "The penalty for sleeping on watch is death, priest. You know this." "We will speak to the governor," Caius promised. "If this report gets to him, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. You are under our protection now." Caius leaned in close. "Here is your story. His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were sleeping. That is what you will say to everyone." Valerius looked at the gold, then at the priest. He saw the desperation in Caius's eyes. He realized then that these religious men did not believe in their own God. They believed in control. "As you say," Valerius muttered. He took the money. He distributed it to his men. They left the residence, their pockets heavy with the price of a lie. They walked out into the streets of Ethelgard and began to spread the story. They told the merchants. They told the tavern keepers. They told anyone who asked. "The disciples stole him," they said. But as Valerius walked away, he looked at his own hands. He could still feel the vibration of the ground. He could still see the blinding light. He had been paid to lie, but he knew that no amount of gold could bury what had happened in that garden. They had tried to seal the tomb with stone, and it failed. Now they were trying to seal the truth with gold. Valerius had a sinking feeling that this seal, too, would eventually be broken. The tomb was empty, and the world was changing, one lie and one truth at a time. The safe house was a cage of fear. Inside the cramped room in the lower district of Ethelgard, the remaining followers of Elian sat in a circle of despair. The windows were shuttered tight against the morning light. The door was barred with heavy oak beams. Every footstep on the cobblestones outside made them flinch, expecting the iron fist of the Roman guard or the temple police to drag them away to the same fate their master had suffered. They were leaderless, broken men. They had abandoned everything to follow Elian, believing he was the king who would restore the glory of the ancient kingdom. Now, he was dead, buried in a borrowed tomb, and they were fugitives. Then came the pounding on the door. The men froze, gripping the hilts of their concealed knives. The knocking was frantic, desperate. "Open, please, open!" It was a woman's voice. It was Elena. One of the men rushed to unbar the door, pulling it open just wide enough to let her slip inside before slamming it shut again. Elena stood before them, her chest heaving, her hair wild, her face flushed, not with the pale mask of grief, but with a terrifying intensity. "He is not there," she gasped, grabbing the arm of the nearest man. "The tomb is open. The stone is rolled away. He is gone." The men stared at her. A heavy silence filled the room, born of pity rather than belief. They exchanged glances. They thought the sorrow had finally broken her mind. "Elena," an older disciple said gently, stepping forward to calm her. "We know you loved him. We are all grieving, but you must rest. The strain is making you imagine things." "I am not imagining," Elena shouted, her voice ringing off the stone walls. "I saw the linens. They were lying flat, as if he passed right through them. I saw the messenger. He told us, 'Why do you look for the living among the dead?' 'Because he is dead,' the man snapped, his own grief turning to anger. "We saw him die, Elena. We saw the spear enter his side. Death is the one thing that does not change. It is over." "It is not over," she insisted, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "He said he would rise on the third day. Today is the third day. Why do you not believe?" They turned away from her, sinking back into their gloom. It was too good to be true, and in their experience, things that were too good to be true were usually cruel lies. They locked the door again, shutting out her hope, shutting out the world. But walls could not shut out what was coming. Evening fell. The room grew dim, lit only by a single oil lamp. The men spoke in low whispers, planning their escape from Ethelgard, planning to scatter back to their fishing boats and their tax booths, to forget the dream that had died on the hill. Suddenly, the conversation died. The air in the room changed. The temperature did not drop. It rose, becoming charged with a strange electric vibrancy. The hair on their arms stood up. The flame of the oil lamp flared bright white, then settled. No door had opened. No lock had clicked. No footsteps had approached. But Elian was standing in the center of the room. The collective gasp sucked the air out of the space. The men scrambled backward, crashing into tables and chairs, pressing themselves against the walls in sheer terror. They thought it was a spirit, a vengeful ghost come to haunt them for their cowardice. "Peace be with you," Elian said. The voice was unmistakably his. It was not the hollow whisper of the grave. It was warm, resonant, and alive. He looked different, yet exactly the same. The bruises were gone. The swelling from the beatings had vanished. His posture was upright, radiating a strength that made the room feel small. Yet, as he held out his hands, the scars were there. The marks of the nails were visible in his wrists, not as open wounds, but as badges of a battle won. "Why are you troubled?" Elian asked, looking at each of them with eyes that held no condemnation, only infinite patience. "Why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself." He walked toward them. He did not float. His feet struck the floor with the solid sound of flesh and bone. He reached out and touched the shoulder of the man who had doubted Elena. The touch was warm. It was firm. It was the touch of a living man. "Touch me and see," Elian commanded gently. "A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." Trembling, the disciple reached out. His fingers brushed the scar on Elian's hand. The reality of it shattered his skepticism. The sob that escaped his throat was the sound of a heart breaking open to let joy in. He fell to his knees. One by one, the others followed, clinging to his feet, weeping, laughing, overwhelmed by the impossible reality standing before them. He ate with them. He took a piece of broiled fish and ate it while they watched, proving that he was not a vision, not a hallucination. He was physically, tangibly back. The laws of nature had been rewritten in that room. Death had swallowed him, but it could not digest him, and now he had torn his way out, bringing the keys of eternity with him. Meanwhile, in the barracks of the Imperial Guard, Commander Marcus was packing his kit. He placed his helmet on the table. He looked at the short sword that had been his constant companion for 20 years. He ran his thumb along the blade. It was sharp, efficient, a tool of the Empire. But as he looked at it, he felt a wave of revulsion. He could not forget the man on the cross. He could not forget the forgiveness he had heard. He could not forget the way the earth had trembled, as if acknowledging a superior authority. Marcus picked up the sword and slid it into its scabbard, but he did not strap it to his waist. He left it on the table. He was done with Rome. He was done with the Pax Romana that was built on blood. He had seen a different kind of kingdom, one that did not kill its enemies but died for them. He did not know where he would go, but he knew he could no longer serve a lesser king. He walked out of the barracks into the night, a deserter from the army of Caesar, a new recruit in a silent army he was only beginning to understand. In the upper city, Nam Turk Alden sat in his library, staring at the scroll of the prophets. The door opened, and Scholar Cato entered. They did not need to speak. The news was whispering through the city like a secret wind. The tomb was empty. The soldiers had been bribed. The body was missing. Alden looked up, a smile slowly spreading across his tired face. It was the smile of a man who had bet everything on a long shot and won. "We were not fools, Cato," Alden whispered. "We were not fools." "No," Cato replied, his eyes shining. "We were just early." They had risked their reputations to bury a corpse, only to find that they had prepared the bed for a resurrection. The fear of the council, the fear of Silas, the fear of being cast out, it all seemed trivial now. They had touched the infinite. They had wrapped the eternal in linen. Their secret faith was no longer a burden. It was a badge of honor. They knew that tomorrow they would walk into the council chamber, not as hidden believers, but as witnesses. Back in the safe house, the mood had transformed from a funeral to a festival. Elian stood at the door, ready to depart, though they knew now that he would never truly leave them. "You are my witnesses," Elian told them, his voice filling the room with authority, "to Ethelgard and to the ends of the earth. You have seen the darkness, and you have seen the light. Now, go and tell the world that the grave is not the end." He stepped out into the night, vanishing from their sight, but his presence remained. The fear was gone. The door that had been barred was thrown open. Helena stood in the doorway, looking out at the city of Ethelgard. The stars were shining, indifferent to the miracle below, but to her they looked different. Every light seemed to be singing. The nightmare of the last 3 days had dissolved into a waking dream of glory. The execution was history. The tomb was empty. The empire would fall, kingdoms would crumble, and generations would pass away, but this moment would stand forever. The day the sun went dark was only the prelude to the day the sun rose. Elena took a deep breath of the cool night air. It tasted like freedom. She stepped out onto the cobblestones, followed by the men who were no longer cowards, but heralds of a new dawn. The story of Elian was not finished. It was just beginning, and as they walked into the sleeping city to wake it up, they knew that nothing, not death, not life, not angels, not demons, would ever be the same again.